And now we're going to kick off our program with an economic overview. Our speaker is Dr. Johannes Moenius, a professor. He is the William R. and S. Sue Johnson Endowed Chair of Spatial Economic Analysis and Regional Planning at the School of Business, University of Redlands. The growing concerns of automation in the region have only been accelerated by COVID-19, and Dr. Moenius will provide an updated study on the impacts of automation and data identifying how Western Riverside County's service-based economy needs to shift to one driven by innovation. His unique study will highlight automation resilient skill sets needed in a post-pandemic world. Over to you, Dr. Moenius.
Hello, my name is Johannes Moenius. I am a professor at the University of Redlands. I teach global business, but I also direct the Institute for Spatial Economic Analysis. And in the last couple of years, a major focus of our research was what will be the effect of automation on our workforce with all the changes that we're seeing. And as you may imagine, more recently, what we were interested in is, did COVID-19 change this entire situation? So if we really think about it in a larger context, then we need to understand that our medical technology has improved so much that we're detecting a lot more epidemics, some of them locally, some more widespread, and we probably also have more. If you compare the numbers, then in the last 20 years, we actually were able to detect or were exposed to about as much or as many pandemics and epidemics than in the entire 100 years before. For our current situation, and that applies to a lot of those epidemics, medical solutions are generally distant. Of course, there might be antiviral medication. There may be a vaccine, but normally that takes 4 to 6 years development time. The success rate is by no means 100%. Medical doctors tell me it's normally 40 to 60% for vaccines like for influenza. And if it's really a pandemic, you always face a supply challenge, how to produce billions of them in order to protect your population. So the economic responses that we're seeing specifically right now are very widespread. We have behavioral changes. We have the attempt of suppliers to immunize their supply chains. And one part of that is that they'll actually try to source more locally. And that is something that is important for a place like the Inland Empire, because deglobalization means our logistics sector will not be as busy anymore. And the other thing that suppliers try to do is they try to automate in order to have fewer people that may be exposed to viruses in the supply chain and able to use no matter what. And of course, automation can also strengthen the deglobalization movements. So technology plays a major role, both in terms of behavioral changes as well as automation. And so what I'll try to do is I'll try to focus more on automation, but I want to at least mention some of the behavioral changes that change our economic environment now. Everyone does everything online, shopping, meetings, they work from home. We also have increased savings. I'll show you a graph in a second about that. We have the avoidance of anything that may involve other people. People are careful to go to the hairdresser to look for personal services and so on. And there are very few large events. There are some by now, as we know. Consumer spending is still down. This is for Riverside County. We're still about 20% almost down relative to before COVID-19 hit. Globalization has passed its peak. It looks like, at least in terms of the percentage of GDP. And the current political climate is not so much in favor of global trade. And that has, specifically the conflict with China, has direct implications again for the Inland Empire. Why is that? Well, as a trade conflict with China makes people or suppliers move to places like Indonesia or Vietnam, they don't use the same shipping routes. They may actually use shipping routes that go towards the East Coast. As a consequence, the ports of LA and Long Beach lost their top status in the country. The busiest port is now New York and New Jersey, and yeah, the ports of LA and Long Beach are about 30% down. So what's the consequence? What's the whole background of that? What does that mean for us? Well, the way I see it is we're in the midst of an entire restructuring of our economy. The only certain thing that we are seeing is that uncertainty has increased. Well, that means then therefore historical data is useless, correct? And I can be done with my presentation because I'm a data guy. Or is it not? Well, how can we think about it? Well, there's the good. The good of that situation is that, well, at least from what we can tell, we have passed the rock bottom state. The bad, of course, is that the recovery is slow, and in terms of automation, many researchers argue that COVID-19 has pulled us literally several years further into the case of automation. So if we automate, most likely that means slower labor market recovery. The hopeful, however, is that we know much better how to respond to these challenges thanks to the analytical tools that we have available. And I want to present some of that in what's coming right now. So some of you who have seen this parts of that presentation on automation before may recognize some of the slides that I'm showing you right now. Well, the first thing is that I really want to have you be aware of is that this time is not different in some ways. But we need to answer the question, well, if technology has been always great for creating new jobs, why are we worried right now? And why are we arguing that possibly this leads to massive job losses? Well, let's take a look. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, the IT revolution, the Internet revolution, we always had more jobs after those than before. But what people don't tell you is that all these industrial revolutions or economic or technology revolutions have always led to stagnant real wages. In essence, some researchers argue that during the Industrial Revolution, real wages were actually constant for more than 2 generations. If you look at the more recent technological revolutions, the Internet revolution and the digital revolution, then what you can see here by the level of education, where the top line representing the highest level of education, postgraduate degrees, and the lowest line representing high school dropouts, then what you can see is that jobs, the wages increased substantially for people with high level of education, but actually they fell for people with lower levels of education. So overall, that means technological revolutions increase income inequality. If you look at manufacturing labor productivity growth, well, it's interesting that most Americans know that the employment in manufacturing fell, but few are actually aware that manufacturing output increased over the last 30 years or so. And so the productivity growth in the labor productivity growth for manufacturing specifically was about 3.2% annually. So what makes it different this time? So it's what I call the 4S. It's speed, size, substitution, technology, and scale. James Manieka, the head of the McKinsey Global Institute, said, well, in the last 5 years or so, we have seen those technologies make more progress than in the last 50 years before, specifically the artificial intelligence part. And what he refers to is pretty much the numbers of patents. We've seen more patents in the last 5 years in terms of artificial intelligence than the last 50 years combined. The big issue that we're seeing is that the robots have been traditionally kept in the manufacturing sector. Now we see service robots. We see agricultural robots. So these sectors are way larger in terms of employment than manufacturing. And if we see robots enter this area, then this may be a problem. The next part is substitution. If you think of the internet revolution, the industrial revolution, the digital revolution, it was always pretty much one particular type of technology that really drove the whole system. Now we're seeing, depending on whom you ask, at least several. Here I list 7 of them. And if you take a close look, you'll notice that the first 5 here are related to computer technology, one way or another. And advances in computer technology, we understand pretty well, and we understand that they're quite predictable. And the next and last part here is the scale. Just think about it. Everyone in this room probably, or wherever you are, has in essence an artificial intelligence device in their pocket. Siri, Cortana, you name them, these are nothing else than artificial intelligence devices. And the of those increased from 7% market share to 70% market share in terms of cell phones. And we are now, within just 7 years, and we're now delivering about 1.5 billion units per year. So the big question that we always ask ourselves, well, if that's all coming, if it's not one technology, if all those 4 factors are coming together, will we be able to transform our economy in as little as 2 decades? And now with COVID-19, we even have less time for that. What's driving all that? Well, robots get cheaper relative to labor costs. Now, if you start tracking it from 1990 and look at labor costs versus robot prices, the scissor are now widened almost 4-fold. How about Amazon? Well, Amazon in 2013 had 1,000 robots. In June 2017, they had 45,000 robots, and they're still increasing. This with a growth rate of 260% per year. Service robots, by the way, not industrial robots. How about industrial robots? What's their effect on jobs? Well, there's a famous study by Acemoglu and Restrepo published in 2017, where they showed that each robot in the industrial sector pretty much costs around 5.6 jobs. If we assume that manufacturing is going to, would have increased the same way, what you can see now with a light blue line on top, that would have been the manufacturing jobs increase. If we had just smoothly sailed along as we did during the recovery from the Great Recession, this would have been our job numbers. Well, with the same amount of increase in robots as we had it historically, a 13% deployment rate per year, what we'd actually be seeing is a severe drop in manufacturing, which is the darker blue line that crosses in the middle. The dotted line is the increase in the number of robots. So you can see in this example, the projection, that's not a forecast, that's a projection forward. We would go from 12 million to 2 million jobs within 20 years with the same level of output or output increases in manufacturing. So if we look at certain types of groups, here specifically the young, less educated minorities in the Midwest, and we look at the employment increases that they've seen, here measured as the employment to population ratio. If we actually think of it in the way that, say, the recovery hadn't happened, would they also have seen such an increase in the employment to population ratio? And the answer is no. They would have actually seen a fall. And these are the first early signs that automation takes its toll. Well, I'll argue that we're already seeing what's coming, and what we see is what we're going to get. a study published in 2017 estimated that 47% of current total US employment could be automated in the next decade or two. So what are those automating robots like? Well, there's Flippy, the hamburger flipping robot. That is actually visible in, or you can visit him, her, it in Pasadena. Then there is the Amazon robots, these orange pots that you see down there that carry the bookshelves to the people who fill the carts. And this is, by the way, Amazon tomorrow. Why? Robots don't need any lights. You can switch off the lights in the Amazon warehouses. So Amazon tomorrow, when you switch on the lights, looks more like this. But is that really true that we can completely switch off the warehouse? Well, not quite. The Uniqlo's warehouse here cuts labor by 90%. Ford has a delivery robot that, in combination with their delivery trucks, that can take care of the 50 feet of delivery. Singapore Airport has an automated terminal that pretty much has only one person at the customs. The rest is all completely automated. And well, once you can pick strawberries with a machine, robots can do pretty much everything. What does that mean for employment projections? Well, a couple of years back, 3-4 years back, we did a study and looking at the geographies most at risk and put that on a map. And you can see that there are places like Silicon Valley that don't seem to be as hard hit. South Florida, hard hit. Las Vegas, really hard hit. Well, and us, not looking that great either. In effect, we're the most vulnerable metro in California to job automation. 63% of the jobs could be automated in the next 20 years in the Inland Empire overall. It's a little lower for WRCOG, as you'll see in a second. Why is that? Employment is concentrated in office and administrative support, transportation, material and moving, food preparation and serving, and sales and related jobs. And the historical growth in these industries was actually not that great. But the future automation risk is high. How high? Well, if you look at the first, the top 5, then what you can see is that it's literally, all above or close to 80%. We have a few shiny exceptions, and that's healthcare, education, and management for being lower in terms of automation probability. And these are actually highly rising job numbers here in the Inland Empire. My apologies. So the problem with that study is that it tells you something about technical automatability. It doesn't mean actually that everything that is automatable will be automated. Just think about going to a high-end restaurant. Is it really likely that you see a robot waiting your table? Before COVID-19, I would have like really argued, no way, you'll never see one. I'm actually not that sure about that anymore. Anyway, the big question for me and for us all was twofold. Number one was, well, technical automatability versus actual automatability. Are we going to see that at all? And so the answer was, we don't know what share of the technical automatable jobs will be automated. And then the next uncomfortable question was, well, if the automation, the share of job automation is so high, well, what are we going to do with the whole workforce? What shall we teach our kids? And then I always got pale, stumbled, and then tried to pull something out of the hat. Well, not quite out of the hat. We had some understanding, but we didn't have a deep level of understanding. And so we tried to resolve that issue. So we actually found a public government curated database that presents a lot of information about work or occupation-related aspects like the work context, the skills required, the abilities needed, the work activities done, and so on. And it's collected from job holders, so every couple of years, and for those where that was not available, from occupational experts. It's a little hard to work with that because they are updated regularly, but the intervals vary by occupation. Why is that valuable? Well, they also asked about the degree of automation in the job at certain time intervals. This allows us now to compare actual automation as it happened on the jobs with those predicted by those forward-looking approaches. We can also think about the specifics of these occupations and how that correlates with automation. And we can do a comparison between the region relative to the nation, literally on a skill-by-skill basis. So if we now look at the technical possibility of job automation in the WRCOG economic region, then technically there are about 58% of all jobs that can be automated. If we just look at the historical automation for the types of jobs that are located in the area and project that forward, then this number is 33%. So is that a big hope? Well, I think it's rather a piece of information that we should consider very carefully, because what it means that the total, even if we don't have a major technological disruption, we probably see 33% of job reduction induced by automation, and we would have to replace that with new jobs or expansion of the economy and so on. The interesting thing now is if you look at the level of automation historically and correlate that with the future automation, then this correlation is quite low. It's at 0.2%. For those who haven't studied statistics, a high correlation is close to 1. A high negative correlation would be close to -1. So 0.2 is like a little bit of a correlation. It's significant, but it's by no means a one-to-one relationship. So current levels of automation are not predicting future automation well. Actually, if we write forward the projected future automation from historical data and compare it with the future automation as predicted by robot-based or computerization-based models, the correlation is actually 0. It's no relationship at all. When I first saw that, I was like, there must be something wrong. But no, there's nothing wrong. It's perfectly correct, because historical automation was mainly concentrated in certain types of professions and industries. Future automation will be a lot broad-based, a lot more broader-based. Just think about what I said early on. Historically, like what we saw was pretty much that we saw robots only show up in the manufacturing sector, and now we're seeing them everywhere, including the service sector. And that's exactly what this correlation coefficient confirms. So the data is consistent with our observations. So the future is not a surprise. The future is entirely different in terms of automation than the past. And that allows us to identify the jobs which should expect the largest disruptions. And we also are able to establish a baseline scenario for moving forward. So if you looked at the historical, or the forward-looking predictions that I've done before, this is just a graph, you could clearly see that, for example, the light blue block trade, transportation, utilities would shrink in the next 20 years, while the middle green big block, healthcare and education, would increase over the next 20 years. But it would actually still lead to an shrinkage of the workforce despite population growth. Now let's compare the 5 largest occupation groups that are high risk in the future versus those that are what's predicted by simply writing forward what we've seen. And we can see that it's actually only the food preparation and serving related industry or occupations that we get to the same kind of conclusion. For all others, it's a little lower. So comparing those really means we get an idea of where to see the disruptions. Now, that has a lot of interesting implications. What if the historical trends simply continue? We can now see which jobs we should expect not to be as prevalent in the future. What change in automation growth rates to expect if there was a radical change? So, for example, a new type of technology coming in, as we see with mobile robotics. And finally, if COVID-19 really pushed us 5 or 10 years into the future, what is the new baseline? And we can use simply by the forward projections to tell us what to expect in 5 or like next year based on our 5 or 10-year advanced scenarios. Now, COVID-19 has another aspect that I really want to point out, and that's really important in this context. Number one, it's, there are 2 types of industries that were always mentioned in the news. One was the essential industries, and the others were the so-called high-touch industries. How automatable are they? First, notice that essential industries and high-touch industries have a large overlap. Of the essential industries, almost 70% in this forward-looking projection are actually automatable. In the high-touch industries, this number is quite a bit lower, and historically we would have expected that those industries would not be affected as much anyway because of the personal touch that they delivered. So if we just look at the historical job growth in California, then you may half close your eyes and notice that most of the big arrows are inland and the small arrows are on the coastline. If you look at the recent drop, then what you see is most of the big drops are on the coast and the small drops have been inland. So is that now good news for the inland? Well, if we look at automation potential, coastal versus inland, what you notice is that the red dots are inland. So we have been spared major disruptions recently, but it's actually not looking that great for us in the long run because employers already start to move towards automation to immunize their supply chain and respond to the high-touch challenge. So the coast has probably seen the worst. The inland, not so much possibly, because we expect faster rehiring on the coast and slower rehiring inland because the inland areas are most susceptible to automation. Now, what about skills composition? The final answer to, well, what shall we teach? How shall we design workforce development? What kind of industrial policy should we do? So there is something that we really need to understand. We need to convert jobs from those where automation replaces tasks, because then wages go down, to those where automation augments tasks, because that's where wages go up. Now, previous studies have already shown, here one by McKinsey & Company again, that there are certain activities that are highly susceptible to automation. This is data collection, processing data, and predictable physical work. And there's other type of work, specifically management, expertise, interface, and unpredictable, physical work where we actually can see that when we are able to transfer those jobs out of the blue zone into the orange zone, we're good. And the blue zone is big. It's 51% of all US wages. And there's something worthwhile thinking about. Now, we were then interested in looking at, well, what do we actually need to do? And how can we think about it? So we just developed two very basic measures about skill depth and skill breadth. What is the average job occupation now required to do in terms of the level of skills versus the number of skills people need to have? And the interesting thing was that on average, both, if we compare 2000 to 2020, both the skill depth and the breadth were actually shrinking, and they were shrinking faster for those jobs that were high in skill depth or high in skill breadth. And they were actually rising for those that were low in skill depth and or low in skill breadth. So this means that as we face automation and as we face the future, we need to specifically think about the types of jobs that currently don't require a depth or breadth of skills, because these are the people that will need to be upskilled, and both in terms of level as well as in the number of skills they have. Now, we can break that down literally to a skill by skill perspective. And so here I looked at writing level, for example, for the US and the WRCOG region before and after, and compared to operations and control. And you can clearly see that after automation, then people need to have higher writing level skills. So those expected to be employed will require higher writing levels. And those who we expect that operations and control levels will be lower. And for the breadth, that's exactly the same thing. So how should we respond to automation then? Now we can answer questions like what to teach our kids, how to do workforce development, and what should regional economic policy look like in response to automation. And the answer lies in what I call the 4 E's: education, enterprises, entrepreneurship, and environment. We need to train people, we need to bring in the right industries, we need to foster entrepreneurship, and we need to preserve our environment so that we can attract people that want to do entrepreneurship, that we attract headwaters for enterprises and keep the people in the region. So the data speaks a very clear language. There's 3 paths to success here. One is higher education, the second is certification, and the third is apprenticeships. All 3 are negatively correlated with automation, both historical and expected future automation. So we pretty much need to develop a hybrid model between the US and Europe as it is right now. So what shall we teach? Well, here I just give you 3 examples. In terms of basic skills, it's literally reading and writing. In terms of social skills, and as I said, these are only examples, it's service orientation. And for systemic skills, it's decision making. These are the types of general skills that we really need to think about in the future. So what about regional economic policy? Well, we know now that workforce development can focus on those types of skills. It needs to focus on micro-certification, and it needs to help and rebuild the structure for installing apprenticeships in companies. So the second part is that we can actually do data-driven industrial policy, because we know what kind of workforce will be set free through automation, and we can match that with the industries that know exactly or need exactly that type of workforce. And the third is, of course, entrepreneurship, which brings us new jobs, but those jobs are actually most likely somewhat correlated with automation, but it pushes it forward. So what are the actions that we recommend? Well, the first is preserve resources. preserve your high quality living areas, your prime industry locations, make sure that you accelerate automation in the public sector. So if you are leading the pack, you will preserve your resources. And like if you listen to this presentation a year ago, I said recession-proof the budgets. If you followed the advice, you're fine now, or at least not as hard hit. We still need to future-proof them. And we need to build up future-oriented educational resources that allow for this micro-certification and strengthen and reform our higher education system so that it can meet the future needs. And lastly, we need to reduce the setup and transaction costs for entrepreneurship. If you wonder whether such a big transformation can really happen, well, look at history. In the Easter Parade in 1900, that's what Fifth Avenue looked like. It was all horse carriages. That's the same parade in 1913. So we need to start today. Thank you very much. I hope I was able to give you some positive outlook into the future, despite the challenges that we face right now. And I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you again.
Well, good morning, Dr. Moenius. It's so good to see you, and thank you for tuning in to all of you that are on our YouTube live page. I'm really excited for the opportunity to moderate the live Q&A portions for today's webinar. And for those of you who do not know me, my name is Rachel Singer, and I work at the Western Riverside Council of Governments. And as a housekeeping note, if you would like to participate in our live Q&A, please make sure to go on to slido.com and then put in the code FUTUREFORWARD to submit a question. So Dr. Moenius, it's so good to see you. You talked about a variety of different challenges surrounding automation. So what would you say, if you could narrow it down, what would you say is the biggest challenge when it comes to practically addressing automation in light of COVID-19?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we are facing specifically here in the area, and that's applying not only for West Riverside County, but also for the Inland Empire overall, is our high dependence on just a small number of sectors, namely the logistics sector, that if our data is correct and like all the expert opinions are correct, will see a incredibly fast wave of automation coming within the next 2-3 years already. And so that means we need to be prepared that either a lot of the people that have been released from the job market or are, like when we probably see readjustment of online shopping versus the regular shopping. And how do we make sure that these people get the right skills, trained quickly, so that they can transition out of their current jobs into future jobs that are not susceptible to automation. And for that, we need to know which jobs have a low automation potential and what kind of skills do they need to be trained in. And that's exactly what we try to address in our study.
Yeah, definitely. And I do want to make one quick note. I wanted to clarify that the code for on Slido is forward 3. The code for Slido is forward 3. But Dr. Moenius, so another question for you. So the big question is, what is government's role in the conversation about expedited automation of jobs? And how do we empower or encourage ownership from the private sector to also act in these moments as well?
So these are, in essence, two different aspects. One is the role of government. So the government has been, of course, thanks to the way unemployment is recorded and how people search for new jobs, has played a big role in directing people into new types of skill sets, into new jobs, and so on, help them find those new jobs. So now the government is in the position when someone comes in and applies or says like, oh, I'm unemployed, what shall I do? To analyze or actually just simply look up what are the skill sets and what kind of like are the least cost paths to get them into a new type of job. That's the first role. The second role is literally making sure that the whole setup of the region is in a position to move us quicker into a post-automation industry structure that involves the economic policy that's needed to attract the types of industries that are best fit for our workforce set free, not the workforce that is currently employed or stays employed. It's a workforce that will be likely set free, and attract those ones, and then also make sure that we have an entrepreneurial space ready for people that come up with new ideas. COVID-19 has been a catalyst for ideas, for innovation, and we see that back and front, that those find a home, find easy to navigate government processes so that their entrepreneurial efforts can be focused on the task of creating jobs and not on administrative issues. And for the private sector, one of the data points that we have is like the two keys in terms of education or in terms of getting long-term jobs is micro-certification and apprenticeships, the European type model. Currently, that is not very well established in the United States. So coming up with types of apprenticeships that are right for the types of tasks and jobs that are providing the future, that is going to be a major challenge, but also a highly rewarding one, because we're able to bring back what we've lost over the last 20 years, and that's a middle class.
So you're talking quite a bit about entrepreneurship and the role that plays in addressing automation. So how can we train our youth to foster entrepreneurial skills? And is this something that even is trainable to begin with? And if so, how can we even be more intentional in our educational curriculum? That's kind of a trickle-down effect.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple aspects to that. The first and most important skill that we need to train our kids from primary school onward and go all the way through high school and forward afterwards is the most important skill is being able to acquire skills, new skills themselves, with maybe just a little bit of guidance, that we're going away from the lecture to the project, to the self-learning, to the self-studying, to the awakening of interest, and so on. And so that's been kind of, a mantra that's been put out for decades, but never been implemented really. So, I mean, that's absolutely crucial. The second thing is like, there's nothing that prevents projects in the classroom to be setting up an online store. Having them literally get the experience. Or, I mean, I teach global business. I require my students to do a market entry pitch into a foreign country. And that can be whether it's a new product or an existing product for their current company or for a company that they dream of working for. Getting them work through the entire process, making the pitch then to real investors, so that you pretty much have the integration of the kids at school or the students in the university and the outside real life world, I think is very crucial.
Yeah, the bridging that connection between the classroom and real life experience. So we actually have a question from the audience. So question for Dr. Moenius. I'm curious about the government curated database you mentioned that has job skill information gathered from job holders and employers. Are you able to share a link or more information about the data source?
Well, the database is one that's been actually used quite broadly by other researchers as well. It's called ONET, and you just need to Google it. You'll find it easily. The problem with ONET is that it's not very user friendly. So we've spent a lot of time, because data is gathered at different points in time. So to making it actually comparable is quite hard to get reliable answers from it. So we spend a lot of time trying to match that up in such a way that you can make it usable. And so, but it's accessible to everyone.
Awesome. And then another question for you. Let me highlight this really quick. What are some examples of jobs that are less likely to be automated in the coming years that do not require a college education?
Oh, that don't require college education. Oh, so I actually, I'd be happy to answer that, by email or so, because I really need to look that up. So the standard answer is always, if I get that question, is which jobs are yeah, pretty much automation proof, while kindergarten teachers, that's, you know, like your ideal job. But so pretty much, yeah, if it's specifically without high school education, there's a whole bunch of them. But I don't want to just grab something and then like, you know, I'm just not exactly sure which job requires what. But I'll put up a list on the email answer sheet then for people that are interested in that.
Okay, and then we have a question actually coming in from Arnold San Miguel, so let me highlight that. Are there any examples of where public sector has funded a venture, quote unquote, capital fund to fund the efforts you described that the working poor may also invest to share in the future profits as a way to build wealth?
I mean, there's the whole, I mean, I know a whole bunch of examples in Europe, actually. As you can hear from my accent, I'm from Germany, and that's been already hot in discussion at the time when I was a student, like 30 years back. And so where particularly companies tried to have capital or profit sharing with their workforce, regardless of educational level. And so that people could actually not only invest in their company automatically when they entered the job, they stayed there for a while, they got a share in the company. And so here in the United States, specifically in California, we now have the for-benefit corporations that have the opportunity to do similar things. But there's a whole group of people that work on this, like the B team works on this, then Herat Sabeti is the person to look up here, and so he's driven that movement. That's there's a lot of effort going in this direction right now already.
Mm-hmm. So we actually have two kind of more comments from Scott Brovsky. So I'm going to go ahead and just highlight them. Mm-hmm. But he says that we have a massive effort underway to build a clean tech startup ecosystem mm-hmm. in Riverside and the larger IE region by led by UCR and other key partners. Mm-hmm. And he's curious if you are in the loop of this and if you're aware, and if not, perhaps there's an opportunity to connect.
I'm aware of this, and mm-hmm. like, and I have, I've been approached for contacts, but like my focus is currently specifically on automation in the workforce for like the clean tech sector is hugely important. Don't get me wrong. I actually work with two startups in that area myself here. However, what keeps me up at night is right now that we may face a situation where thousands of families in the Inland Empire will lose their breadwinner positions. And I focus my interest right now, or my work right now there in order to prevent this to happen. Mm-hmm. And I'm grateful for everyone who does this stuff on clean tech. So really don't get me wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we want to just thank you so much for taking the time to be on our webinar this morning and for just your continued investment in the region, doing so much research regarding automation and beyond that as well. I'm going to close out our Q&A time with Dr. Moenius, and we are actually going to transition into our next focus on talent, and it's going to be a panel discussion. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you very much.